Imperium of mankind in the 41st millennium is beset by enemies from all sides. Relentlessly pressured by Xenos threats and embroiled in total grim dark warfare, the Imperium's ability to fortify their frontiers are crumbling. An endless stream of resources is needed to sustain the cosmic amounts of attrition in both troops and supplies. Fortunately for mankind, for over 10,000 years there has been no challenge in the entire universe that the brave bureaucrats of the Administratum haven't been willing to face head-on by relying on their copious amounts of paperwork. On direct orders of the High Lords of Terra, they began scavenging their entire archive for anything that could help the war effort. They performed this momentous task with great vigor, but after 5 months of scrolling through a gazillion spreadsheets, thousands of scribes had died from carpal tunnel syndrome. With no end in sight, things looked bleak. Reboot Guilliman launched a new crusade to Terra to assist. The Avenging Sun vowed to see this accounting task done. Upon arrival, he utilized his mastery over Excel until, with his help, they finally found a long-lost document outlining the missing tithes from planet Ligma in subsector Secondis. It turned out that due to one grammatical error, tithe collecting from the Imperial world had been postponed since the end of the Great Crusade. This negligence over millennia must have accumulated to a staggering amount of resources that the Imperium was missing out on. Additionally, all attempts at communication with the world had failed. This was clearly unacceptable. It was about time that the long-overdue tithe would be collected with interest. The bureaucrats would have the final laugh. The mission would be designated as the Phantom Campaign. Just to be sure, the Administratum would send troops to ensure compliance when collecting the taxes. But with all of the Imperium's forces already scattered across the untold number of encroaching frontiers, they had to order the creation of a new army for this purpose. To boost recruitment numbers, Guilliman made a PowerPoint presentation on Eldar xenobiology and publicly announced his plans for Imperium-wide, officially sanctioned Eldar waifus. Upon hearing this news, the entire male population from Gunnar Prime volunteered for duty and were directly pressed into service. Even several of Guilliman's long-lost popular loyalist brother Primarchs suddenly returned to the Imperium, but definitely not Ferrus Manus. All in all, a small Imperial force of 500 million men had been mustered for the occasion. The military would be stationed as escorts along the fleet of bulk freighters designated to bring back the large amount of anticipated resources back to the throne world. Their journey would not go as smoothly as had been hoped. After a long passage through the warp, Operation Phantom finally arrived in the sector, but warp storms had ravaged the fleet, and over a quarter of the ships had been lost due to demonic incursions whenever their Geller fields had failed for just a few seconds. Not only that, due to the strange effects the warp has on time and space, the fleet arrived over a century later than their initial schedule had indicated. Despite these setbacks, the journey had been considered a success. After all, the collected tithes would more than make up for any losses. Upon their arrival, they discovered that Ligma was under assault by an Orc Wa, led by war boss Squidkisser. The world was merely defended by the local planetary defense forces. Given the situation, they had been able to heroically resist the Green Menace for a solid 24 hours already, which was exactly 23 hours longer than the commanders expected. The Orc horde had completely surrounded the main hive city and was ready to deal the final blow. A mega gargant by the name of Grimkiller Big Stomper had been built from scrap in a cave by mech boy Bony Snark. The crude monstrosity carried more than enough Daka to easily breach the walls. If the brutal orcs were able to directly enter the hive, then the defenders would not be able to hold out for much longer. And so it seemed that the Tithe fleet had arrived just on time. Realizing the need for swift action, the Imperials moved into attack. After boring the orcs to death with a long-range void battle, the ramshackle enemy fleet decided to disengage and withdrew. War boss Squidkisser personally left the system, leaving a big part of his war stranded on the surface. The fleet moved into lower orbit and proceeded to deliver an orbital bombardment right on top of the remaining Xenos army. Despite dropping bombs the size of Hab blocks directly on top of the enemy, many of them would survive the bombardment. They had been moved into the outskirts of the city and hunkered down to seek cover. The cunning foe would not be dislodged through heavy ordnance alone. The Astra Militarum began to make planetfall onto Ligma's surface. The close-quarters urban fighting that followed was fierce. Commanders had to admit that bayonet charges against the Greenskins proved statistically less effective than the training doctrine had prescribed, nor did the Guardsmen combat instruction manuals seem entirely accurate in their description on how to kill an orc in melee. The most conservative estimates claim that approximately 90% of the Imperial Guard had perished in the battle, but regardless of the losses, the enemy was successfully pushed back and retreated into the barren deserts of the planet. Despite a curious amount of fungi growing all over the place, it seemed that the orcs had been decisively defeated. The Hive City had been liberated. All in all, it was considered a strategic Imperial victory. With the foe out of the way, the Tithe fleet wrongly assumed they could immediately proceed with the collection of resources. The governor was of course grateful for their assistance and willing to comply, but he would remind the delegation that on this world local regulation dictates that tithe collection is bound to strict protocol. He would first have to consult with the Council of Local Rulers about the details of compliance for the taxation. Such a minor administrative inconvenience would only take a few years at most, granted that there would be no hiccups in the process that could potentially delay it by a few decades or so. And naturally, in the meantime, any government expenses, including their luxurious but totally necessary lush autocrat living quarters, would have to be deducted from the tithe's total. The Imperium's ruling class does love democracy after all. The arrival of the fleet had attracted the attention of a nearby Dark Eldar fleet. Seeing that the orcs had been defeated and the guard forces decimated, they opportunistically moved in to raid the planet. Although they were wearing skin-tight latex, these were not the type of hot Eldar girlfriends the guardsmen had been promised. A Drukhari assassin targeted the governor and killed him with a liquefier gun. With the planet's leadership taken out, and too few guard troops left to effectively repel the invasion, the remaining resistance had very little hope of successfully holding out. No doubt aware of the Dark Eldar's gruesome reputation, they knew their future looked very grim-dark indeed. The Xenos intended to abduct as many prisoners as possible. Their victims would be taken back to their degenerate dungeons in Komara to serve as furniture for a Drukhari noble, or worse. Preferring to fight and die on their feet, rather than become the slaves of depraved aliens, the remaining Imperial Guard intended to make one last stand against the Xenos. What they were not aware of was that an Astartes strike force was already on their way. The renowned chapter master Bigus Dickus, with over 300 confirmed bloodthirster kills to his name, arrived and made a drop pod strike on the planet. The reinforcements had come just in time to prevent the Drukhari raid. With the strike force of the Emperor's Angels standing in their way, the cowardly aliens would definitely rethink their plans. With the situation seemingly stabilized for now, the new governor of Ligma was appointed. Things seemed to return to normal. The devastation of the war had, however, caused food shortages on the planet. The population was starving. Some food was eventually supplied by an opportunistic rogue trader who extorted the defenders for a few crates of corpse starch. Inside the Hive Cities, trouble was brewing. The instability caused by the recent events had been a catalyst for revolution. Things spiraled out of control when out of nowhere a Genestealer cult member assassinated the newly appointed governor. This act of violence served as the signal for cultists all over the planet to rise up. Many of the planetary defenses were sabotaged, and gangs of Genestealers now swarmed the streets trying to take over important infrastructure in a coup for power. The Imperial forces struck back hard in an attempt to restore order. The Chaos cultists that had long been suppressed took advantage of the mayhem and rose up. They began to openly proselytize their dark religion. With civil war on the planet, bands of orcs still freely roaming the wastelands, and Drukhari still lurking on their very doorstep to turn them into sex toys and furniture. Many of the civilians had reached their breaking point. They turned to the seductive promises of the dark gods for salvation. Before long, they were being openly worshipped by a growing part of the increasingly desperate population. Emotions of pain and suffering on the planet ran high and fed directly into the warp, until finally their zealous servants were able to open a portal and summon demons directly onto the world itself. Forces from Nurgle, Slanesh, Khorne, and Tzeentch streamed forth from the warp, engulfing the planet into a nightmare from hell itself. The planet was on the absolute verge of collapse. Realizing they were outmatched, the Astartes sent out a distress call to the Imperium. They didn't know if reinforcements would arrive on time, or at all. The limited number of remaining loyalist forces prepared for a final stand. But the call for aid had in fact been received by the nearby forge world of Pantera Vulcanus Megadeath 5 in the Metallica subsector under the leadership of Belisarius Ballbuster. The Archmagos decided to send their god machines of the Collegia Titanicanus and their corresponding Scutari cohorts in a desperate last-ditch attempt to save the planet. But they would not come alone. Alongside the Mechanicus reinforcements came the zealous warriors from the Adeptus Sororitas, from the Order of the Thick Sisters. They arrived just in time to stabilize the front line. The situation remained dire, but together the forces of humanity managed to defend their holdout on the planet. An Eldar farseer called Tylanthotov had received visions of a soulstone existing on the planet. She used her psychic powers to investigate, and she discovered it was located in the center of the city square. Because a singular soulstone could prevent one Eldari from being murderfucked for eternity by Slanesh, retrieving it would definitely be worth it. And so the Eldari fleet moved up to join the battlefield, all the while trolling every other faction who had absolutely no idea why the Eldar chose to get involved at all. As the Eldar forces steadily fought their way towards the city center, half the Imperial citizens living in the Hive, which were about a few gazillion, were killed in action. But the Farseer considered the minor Monkai genocide but a small price to pay. Meanwhile, the Tau also ended up arriving in the system as part of their 69th sphere of expansion. Half the factions involved had never seen the Blue Xenos before, and the other half simply didn't care. Nonetheless, the Tau would attempt to capture the planet in the name of the greater good, and with the XV Mini Wii 7 battlesuits joined the fray and shot at everyone from a comfortable distance. Simultaneously, as the fighting raged on, the Adeptus Mechanicus began digging operations into the planet's center due to rumors of an ancient STC being buried there, whose priceless schematics could potentially turn the tide of the war. Unfortunately, the planet turned out to be a tomb world, and the Mechanicus excavations awakened the dormant chambers containing the entire Necron army of the ancient Skeletor dynasty. An army of space Terminators proceeded to march towards the surface and join the battle, indiscriminately killing all they encountered, in the ultimate goal of destroying all forms of life. While this was going on, the large Genestealer presence had served as a beacon to guide the large Hive fleet, humongous, towards the planet. The insanely large biofleet moved in and began to dispense a rain of mycetic spores down onto the surface. The Tyranids merged onto the battlefield, also killing all they encountered, in the ultimate goal of consuming all forms of life. At that moment, attracted by the massive scrap that was unfolding on Ligma, War Boss Squidkisser and his War returned to the planet, leading a massive orc invasion that soon covered the surface with excited greenskins. News of this massive shitshow finally reached the rest of the Imperium. The Inquisition sent out an expedition to check on the situation. Upon arrival, they were horrified to learn things were even worse than first expected. The fate of the planet was quickly sealed. Exterminatus was the only option. And so the Inquisition fleet moved into lower orbit and released their payloads, destroying everyone on the planet, with the exception of a few named characters. After the firestorm died down, the Imperium could inspect the ruined planet. Part of the delegation was a squad of Adeptus Femstodes led by Captain General Misandry, who had thus far successfully remained hidden behind the Golden Throne for 10,000 years. Fortunately, they would not have to leave empty-handed. They recovered a half-broken lasgun, one half-eaten rock burger, and 2 traumatized psychers. We sadly have to report that these had to be executed by the Grey Knights for having directly witnessed demonic entities. Nonetheless, at least according to the paperwork that would be sent back to Holy Terra, the Imperial tithe had been successfully collected. Despite the carnage and losing all of their god machines in battle, the Adeptus Mechanicus had successfully recovered the STC, which they proceeded to mysteriously keep secret from the other Imperial factions. The STC was partially damaged, but it did contain one intact blueprint for a sacred piece of technology from Earth's distant past, a 21st century air fryer. As far as they were concerned, this discovery had made their commitment and sacrifices to the battle completely worthwhile. After all, it would make a fine addition alongside the Holy Toaster. It actually also contained one official Games Workshop 3D printing file for a limited edition Primaris Lieutenant miniature. The Omnisci would surely be pleased. The campaign was declared an Imperial victory, and the process of rebuilding the barren, lifeless rock was underway. Within a few generations, Ligma would become a bountiful hive world again, ready to pay their proper tithes to the Imperium once more. Installing a new governor and leaving behind a newly formed planetary defense force, the remaining Imperial forces departed and left the world to rebuild on their own. The new governor received an ultimatum from the Leagues of Votan. They were told to depart their planet immediately. A Chthonian mining guild plasma excavator was approaching Ligma, ready to absorb the rich mineral deposits inside the planet and harvest the terrestrial rock. But without enough ships to evacuate the population, there was nowhere to go. The stubborn space dwarves didn't care and began splitting the planet apart and absorbing its resources along with everyone upon it. A distress call was once again sent out, but by now the planet's location had been lost due to it being written on a single piece of toilet paper. And as the cosmic horrors continued to beset the Imperium from all sides, every department within the Imperium was too busy searching for all the 40,000 Warhammers to notice.